There are moments when faith is tested, not because God appears powerless, but because he appears silent. For the prophet Habakkuk, that silence became almost unbearable. He looked at his own nation and saw violence spreading through the streets. He saw arguments replacing peace, injustice replacing fairness, and laws that seemed unable to protect the innocent. People who should have feared God appeared to prosper, while those who still cared about righteousness were surrounded by corruption. And Habakkuk could not understand it. He believed God was holy. He believed God was just. He believed God saw what was happening. That was precisely why the situation troubled him so deeply. If God did not see the evil, Habakkuk could have blamed ignorance. If God lacked the power to stop it, he could have blamed weakness. But Habakkuk believed neither of those things. So he was left with a far more difficult question. If God sees injustice, hates evil, and possesses the power to act, why does he sometimes seem to wait? That question stands at the doorway of the Book of Habakkuk. Unlike many prophets whose messages begin with warnings directed toward kings, priests, or nations, Habakkuk begins with a complaint directed toward God himself. How long? It is one of the oldest cries of suffering faith. How long must violence continue? How long must justice be distorted? How long can people ignore God without consequence? And how long can someone continue believing that God is in control when everything visible seems to suggest otherwise? To understand why Habakkuk asked these questions, we have to enter the final troubled generations of the kingdom of Judah. Centuries earlier, the tribes of Israel had entered the land of Canaan. They had lived through the age of the judges, established a monarchy, and eventually reached the height of national power under David and Solomon. But Solomon's kingdom did not remain united. After his death, the nation fractured. The northern tribes became the kingdom of Israel, while the southern kingdom of Judah continued under the dynasty of David with Jerusalem as its capital. The northern kingdom eventually fell to the Assyrian Empire. Judah survived. For a time. Jerusalem still stood. The temple built by Solomon still dominated the spiritual landscape of the nation. The descendants of David still occupied the throne. The people still possessed the law, the priesthood, the sacrifices, the festivals, and the memory of God's covenant. From the outside, these things could create the impression that Judah was secure. But possession of sacred institutions did not guarantee faithfulness. Again and again, the biblical record describes generations in which idolatry, injustice, political compromise, and violence spread through the nation. There were also periods of genuine reform. One of the most significant came during the reign of King Josiah. During his reign, a book of the law was found in the temple. Josiah responded with grief and determination. Idolatrous practices were attacked. Covenant worship was restored. The Passover was celebrated with extraordinary seriousness. For a moment, it may have seemed that Judah had turned a corner. But reform imposed from the throne could not automatically transform every heart, and Josiah's death changed everything. He was killed at Megiddo while confronting Pharaoh Necho of Egypt. After his death, Judah entered a period of increasing political instability. Egypt exerted influence over the region. Assyria, once the dominant terror of the ancient Near East, was collapsing, and from Mesopotamia, another power was rising: Babylon. The international order was changing rapidly. Empires were falling, armies were moving, kings were being installed and removed. Small nations like Judah existed between powers far greater than themselves. Yet when Habakkuk looked around, his first complaint was not primarily about the armies beyond Judah's borders. His first concern was the corruption within Judah itself. The book opens with words identified as the oracle that Habakkuk the prophet saw. Then immediately comes his cry. He asks how long he must call for help without receiving an answer. He cries out concerning violence, yet deliverance does not seem to come. He asks why God makes him look at wrongdoing. Why must he continually witness destruction and conflict? The language is important. Habakkuk does not sound like a distant observer commenting on society from safety. The violence is before him. The strife is before him. He is surrounded by it. Whatever specific events prompted his lament, the biblical text presents a society in which moral disorder has become visible and persistent. Then Habakkuk describes the consequence. The law becomes ineffective. Justice never seems to prevail. The wicked surround the righteous, and because of that, justice comes out distorted. It is a devastating picture. The problem is not simply that individual people are committing sins. The institutions that should restrain wrongdoing are themselves failing to produce justice. The law exists, but its purpose is being frustrated. Courts may operate, but their decisions can be twisted. People may still use the language of covenant and religion, while the vulnerable experience something entirely different. Habakkuk is witnessing the widening distance between what Judah claims to be and what Judah has become. And this leads to his crisis. For generations, prophets had warned God's people that covenant rebellion carried consequences. Moses had warned Israel. The prophets had warned kings. Again and again, the people had been called to abandon idolatry, oppression, bloodshed, and injustice. So Habakkuk knows that evil matters to God, yet he watches evil continue. There is a difference between doubting that God exists and struggling to understand what God is doing. Habakkuk's words belong to the second category. He does not abandon God. He speaks to him. He does not say that justice has no meaning. He complains precisely because he believes justice has meaning. His protest grows out of faith. That does not make his questions comfortable, but it makes them profoundly biblical. Scripture does not hide the fact that faithful people sometimes ask difficult questions. Job asked why he suffered. The psalmists repeatedly cried out over apparent abandonment. Jeremiah wrestled with the prosperity of the wicked, and Habakkuk joins that long tradition by bringing confusion into the presence of God, instead of allowing confusion to drive him away from God. This is one of the reasons the book remains so powerful. Habakkuk is not asking a theoretical, philosophical question from a classroom. He is watching a society deteriorate. He sees victims. He sees corruption. He sees the righteous surrounded. He sees the law weakened, and heaven appears quiet. We are not told how long Habakkuk had been praying before the book begins. We are not told exactly which particular acts of violence he had witnessed. We are not given a biography explaining his childhood, his family, or the moment he first became a prophet. The text does not provide those details, and that absence matters. Habakkuk enters the biblical story almost entirely through his conversation with God. We know him through his questions. His identity is inseparable from the burden he carries. The Hebrew prophets were not merely predictors of distant future events. They were covenant messengers speaking into real historical circumstances. They interpreted the present in light of God's character and covenant. They confronted kings. They warned nations. They exposed injustice. They announced judgment. And sometimes, as Habakkuk demonstrates, they also stood before God and asked why his justice had not yet become visible. Imagine the tension. Jerusalem continues its daily rhythms. Merchants conduct business. Officials make decisions. Priests continue religious service. Families work and eat and sleep. Outside the capital, farmers depend upon vineyards, fig trees, olive groves, grain fields, sheep, and cattle. Life continues. But underneath that ordinary rhythm is instability. Judah is spiritually compromised. Regional power is shifting. The old Assyrian world is dying. Egypt is maneuvering. Babylon is rising. And somewhere inside Judah, a prophet is asking how long God will allow the nation's internal decay to continue. Habakkuk seems to expect intervention. Perhaps he expects reform. Perhaps judgment against corrupt individuals. Perhaps another act by which God will cleanse Judah without destroying it. The text does not tell us exactly what answer Habakkuk hoped to receive. But nothing in his first complaint suggests that he was prepared for the answer that came. That is what makes the next moment so important. God speaks. The silence Habakkuk feared was not proof that nothing was happening. The absence of visible judgment did not mean history had escaped God's attention. Habakkuk had been looking at Judah and asking why God did not act. God's response effectively tells him to lift his eyes beyond Judah. Look at the nations. Watch. Be astonished. Something is already moving. The answer begins with a declaration that God is doing a work in Habakkuk's days. A work so astonishing that Habakkuk would struggle to believe it even if someone explained it to him. Those words might initially sound hopeful. A prophet cries out against injustice. God says he is acting. It seems like the answer Habakkuk has been waiting for. But then comes the revelation. God is raising up the Chaldeans, the Babylonians, and suddenly the entire problem changes. The people Habakkuk is shown are not gentle reformers. They are described as fierce and impetuous. They march across vast territories. They seize homes that are not theirs. They inspire fear. Their horses are swift. Their military movement is compared to predators descending upon prey. Their strength becomes their confidence. They sweep forward. They conquer. They gather captives. Kings are mocked. Fortified cities are overcome. This is not the rescue Habakkuk imagined. It is invasion. God's answer to Judah's violence is the rise of a nation famous for violence on a far greater scale. Habakkuk asked why the wicked surrounded the righteous. Now God tells him that an entire imperial army is being raised up. The prophet wanted justice. What he hears sounds like catastrophe. This is the central shock upon which the first half of the book turns. Habakkuk's first question was difficult. Why does God tolerate evil? But God's answer creates an even harder question. How can a holy God use a nation more ruthless than Judah as an instrument of judgment? That question cannot be dismissed by pretending Babylon is righteous. The book never makes that claim. Babylon's power will not mean Babylon has God's moral approval. Its military success will not mean its pride is justified. And being used within God's purposes will not exempt the empire from accountability for what it does. But Habakkuk does not yet have the full explanation. For the moment he has only heard the announcement. The Chaldeans are coming. History is moving toward Judah. The apparent silence of God was not inactivity. This is where the book of Habakkuk begins to overturn one of our easiest assumptions. We often imagine that when God answers a prayer, the answer will immediately remove our confusion. Habakkuk discovers the opposite. Sometimes an answer can deepen the mystery before it resolves it. He had asked for intervention. Intervention was coming. He had asked for justice. Judgment was approaching. But the form it would take forced him to confront questions about God that were even more unsettling than the questions with which he began. And that is the point where Habakkuk's journey of faith truly starts. Not when everything makes sense, not when Judah becomes peaceful, not when danger disappears, but when the prophet receives an answer he does not understand and must decide what to do with it. He could reject what he had heard. He could abandon the conviction that God is just. Or he could do something far more difficult. He could continue the conversation. Habakkuk chooses the third path. He will question God again, but his next complaint will reach deeper. If God is too pure to approve evil, how can he watch Babylon swallow nations? If Judah deserves judgment, what does Babylon deserve? If an empire becomes powerful enough to treat human beings like fish caught in a net, will that empire answer to anyone? And if God truly governs history, where does his justice appear when one violent nation destroys another? Habakkuk had cried out because heaven seemed silent. Now heaven had answered, and the prophet discovered that the answer was more terrifying than the silence. The armies of Babylon were rising. Judah stood in their path, and Habakkuk's greatest struggle was no longer whether God would act. It was whether he could still trust God after learning how he intended to act. Habakkuk had asked God to act. Now he had to face the terrifying possibility that God's action would come through Babylon. The prophet's first complaint had been about violence inside Judah. He had seen law weakened, justice twisted, and the righteous surrounded by the wicked. He wanted God to intervene, but the answer he received did not describe a gentle correction. It described conquest. The Chaldeans were rising. To understand why this answer shook Habakkuk so deeply, we have to understand what Babylon represented in the world of Judah. The ancient Near East was entering a period of violent transformation. For generations, Assyria had dominated the region through military power, forced tribute deportation, and fear. The northern kingdom of Israel had already fallen beneath Assyrian expansion long before Habakkuk's crisis. Samaria had been conquered. Populations had been displaced, and the political landscape of the region had been permanently altered. But empires that appear invincible do not remain invincible forever. Assyria began to weaken, its enemies gathered strength, and Babylon emerged as one of the powers capable of replacing it. The Chaldeans, associated with the Babylonian rise, were not simply another neighboring people living quietly beyond Judah's borders. They represented a new imperial force. Cities would fall before them. Kings would lose their thrones. Nations would discover that ancient borders and long-standing alliances could disappear within a generation. Habakkuk was living in a world where geopolitics could become judgment almost overnight. Judah was small. Babylon was becoming enormous. And God had just told his prophet that the rise of this empire was not occurring outside his awareness. That idea creates an uncomfortable tension. Scripture presents human rulers as responsible for their choices. It also presents God as sovereign over history. Habakkuk is forced to wrestle with both truths at once. Babylon is not described as righteous. Its violence is not celebrated as virtue. Its arrogance will later become the subject of judgment. Yet its rise will play a role in the consequences coming upon Judah. The prophet wanted God to deal with wickedness. He had not expected God to answer through an empire whose own wickedness seemed even greater. This explains why Habakkuk's next words do not sound relieved. He begins by returning to what he knows about God. Are you not from everlasting? His response is almost like a man stabilizing himself by holding on to something solid while everything around him shifts. Habakkuk may not understand God's method, but he begins with God's character. The Lord is eternal. God existed before Babylon. He existed before Judah. He existed before Assyria, Egypt, or any empire whose armies seemed capable of controlling history. Kings rise, dynasties disappear, borders move, cities are destroyed and rebuilt. But God does not become greater when an empire rises, and he does not become weaker when his people are threatened. Habakkuk knows this, and yet knowing it does not remove his confusion. He addresses God as holy. That holiness becomes the foundation of his protest. How can the Holy One use such a nation? Habakkuk recognizes that judgment upon Judah is deserved. That point is essential. He is not arguing that his people are innocent. His first complaint already acknowledged corruption inside Judah. He had seen violence himself. He had witnessed justice being perverted. The question is not whether Judah needs correction. The question is how the chosen instrument of that correction can be Babylon. Habakkuk describes God as too pure to look approvingly upon evil. So he asks why God seems to tolerate treacherous people. Why remain silent when the wicked swallow those more righteous than themselves? Notice the careful comparison. Habakkuk does not suddenly call Judah perfectly righteous. He speaks comparatively. Babylon appears more wicked. That difference matters. Judah is guilty, but Babylon's imperial violence seems to operate on another scale. This is where Habakkuk moves from a national crisis into a theological one. If God judges Judah through Babylon, what does that say about justice? Can an evil empire become powerful enough that its success looks like moral approval? Does victory prove righteousness? Does military power prove divine favor? Habakkuk's book will answer, no. But before that answer comes, the prophet is allowed to voice the problem honestly. He reaches for one of the most striking images in the entire book. Humanity, he says, seems to have been made like fish of the sea. Fish have no ruler to organize their defense. They can be swept together, caught, dragged away. And this is how Habakkuk sees the nations under Babylonian expansion. The conqueror throws out a hook. He gathers people into a net. He drags them away. Then he rejoices over the catch. The metaphor is brutal because it removes every illusion of dignity from imperial conquest. A nation is not treated as a community of families, children, farmers, workers, elders, and worshippers. It becomes prey. A population becomes a catch. Human beings become numbers within an imperial victory. And the conqueror celebrates. Habakkuk pushes the image even further. Babylon, in his description, does not merely use its military power. It effectively worships that power. The conqueror sacrifices to his net. He burns incense to his dragnet. Why? Because the net has made him rich. His military machinery has given him abundance. His weapons, strategy, horses, armies, and political ambition become the source of his confidence. This is idolatry in imperial form. Instead of trusting the Creator, the conqueror trusts the instrument of conquest. Instead of recognizing power as temporary, he treats power as ultimate. And when success becomes the highest proof of legitimacy, there is no natural stopping point. The question becomes inevitable. Will he keep emptying his net? Will he continue destroying nations without mercy? Habakkuk is not asking whether Babylon can conquer. God has already told him that Babylon is rising. He is asking whether there is any limit. If the empire succeeds once, will it succeed forever? If one city falls, what stops the next? If one king is mocked, what prevents the humiliation of another? If violence produces wealth and victory, why would the violent stop using it? This is one of the deepest anxieties underneath Habakkuk's complaint. Unchecked power tends to imagine itself permanent. But Scripture repeatedly shows that no human empire is permanent. Egypt had dominated. Assyria had terrified nations. Babylon would rise. Others would come after Babylon. Each could appear overwhelming within its own generation. But history never belongs permanently to the empire currently winning the battle. Habakkuk cannot yet see the full answer. What he can see is the contradiction. The God he knows is holy. The empire he sees is violent. The judgment upon Judah may be deserved, but Babylon itself cannot be exempt from moral judgment. So the prophet does something remarkable. He waits. Not passively, not indifferently. He takes his position like a watchman. Habakkuk says that he will stand at his watch and station himself on the rampart. He will look to see what God will say to him. The image is military. A watchman stands above a city wall looking toward the horizon. His job is to notice movement before others do. Dust in the distance, an approaching messenger, a caravan, an army, a threat, a sign. Habakkuk turns that physical image into a posture of faith. He has presented his complaint. Now he watches. This is not the silence of someone who has stopped believing. It is the silence of someone waiting for an answer. There is an important difference. Habakkuk has already demonstrated that biblical faith can ask hard questions. Now he demonstrates that faith also waits after asking them. He does not demand that God answer according to his preferred schedule. He does not invent an answer because waiting is uncomfortable. He stations himself. He listens. And perhaps most importantly, he expects to be corrected. He says he will watch to see what God will answer concerning his complaint. There is humility inside that expectation. Habakkuk is bold enough to question, but he is not arrogant enough to assume that his own understanding is complete. That balance defines the spiritual movement of the book. He knows enough about God to protest what seems inconsistent with God's character, but he also knows enough about himself to wait for a larger perspective. This is where Habakkuk becomes more than a story about ancient Judah. The situation is historically specific. The prophet is speaking in a real world of Judah-Babylon imperial warfare, covenant rebellion, and approaching judgment. But the structure of his struggle is recognizable across generations. People often assume faith becomes strongest when every question receives a quick answer. Habakkuk suggests something different. Faith can deepen in the space between the question and the answer. The watchtower matters because nothing has changed yet. Judah is still corrupt. Babylon is still rising. The military threat has not disappeared. Habakkuk has not been given a complete chronology of what will happen. He does not know every detail of the future, but he chooses to remain in conversation with God. He waits for revelation rather than surrendering to despair. And then the answer comes. God tells Habakkuk to write the vision, make it plain. The message is not to remain hidden inside the prophet's private experience. It must be preserved. The vision concerns an appointed time. It moves toward fulfillment. Even if it seems slow, the prophet is told to wait. It will come. It will not ultimately fail. This language introduces one of the central ideas of Habakkuk. God's timing and human perception are not always the same. To Habakkuk, injustice already feels overdue for judgment. Babylon's rise may make events seem even more chaotic. But the divine answer insists that history is moving toward an appointed outcome. Delay is not the same as cancellation. Waiting is not proof that the promise is false. And appearances do not determine the final verdict. This is crucial because Babylon will appear powerful. Its armies will seem unstoppable. Its rulers may behave as if history belongs to them. But power is not the same as permanence. There is a clock Babylon cannot see. There is an appointed limit. There is a judgment beyond military success. And at the center of the answer comes a contrast that will echo far beyond Habakkuk's lifetime. One person is proud. His inner life is not upright. But the righteous will live by faith or faithfulness, a phrase whose richness will later become deeply significant in the New Testament. Before considering those later connections, however, the statement must first be heard in Habakkuk's world. The proud person trusts himself. He lives by expansion, conquest, accumulation, and strength. He believes his power can secure his future. The righteous person lives differently. He remains faithful to God while history appears unstable. The contrast is not between someone who understands everything and someone who does not. Habakkuk himself does not understand everything. The contrast is between pride and faithful dependence. Babylon says in effect, "My power sustains me." Faith says, "God remains trustworthy even when I cannot yet see the outcome." That is a far more demanding kind of faith than simple optimism. Optimism assumes circumstances will improve. Habakkuk is being invited to trust before he knows how much circumstances may deteriorate. The righteous will live by faithfulness, while the arrogant empire expands. That means faith is not merely a feeling produced by safety. It is a way of standing when safety is uncertain. And God's answer does not stop there. The proud conqueror is restless. He enlarges his appetite. He gathers nations. He collects peoples. No amount is enough. Power that becomes an idol cannot be satisfied because every victory creates the desire for another. But eventually the conquered will speak. The victims will not remain silent forever. A series of judgments is about to be pronounced against the oppressor. The empire that gathered the possessions of others will itself face loss. The one who built security through exploitation will discover that those foundations cannot endure. The city built with blood will not escape judgment. Shame will return upon the one who inflicted shame. The idols that cannot speak will be exposed before the living God. Habakkuk had asked whether Babylon could keep emptying its net forever. The answer is no. But that answer will unfold in stages. Before Habakkuk can reach the calm confidence of the final chapter, he must first learn that God's sovereignty over Babylon does not mean God approves Babylon. Being used in history is not the same as being declared righteous. Temporary success is not final vindication. Judgment can operate in more than one direction. Judah can be guilty, Babylon can be guilty. God can discipline one through the other and still hold both accountable according to his justice. Habakkuk's mistake would be to assume that because Babylon is permitted to rise, Babylon is permitted to rise forever. The vision says otherwise. There is an appointed time, and that changes the meaning of waiting. Waiting is not resignation. It is not pretending evil is harmless. It is not denying suffering. Biblical waiting in Habakkuk means living faithfully while the final shape of justice remains unseen. The prophet is moved one step forward. At first he asked why God was silent. Then he was horrified by God's answer. Now he has been told that Babylon's arrogance will not have the final word. But the vision is not finished. If God intends to judge the oppressor, then the crimes of that oppressor must be named. The empire will be confronted not merely for being politically ambitious, but for the moral structure of its power. Greed, violence, exploitation, humiliation, idolatry. Habakkuk has climbed the watchtower asking whether Babylon can continue without restraint. What he is about to hear is a funeral song for the pride of empire. The conqueror believes the world is becoming his possession. God is about to explain why everything he has built already carries the seeds of judgment within it. Habakkuk had received an answer, but he did not yet have peace. God had told him that Babylon was rising. He had been shown that the violence inside Judah would not continue forever without consequence. Judgment was coming, and the Chaldeans would become part of that judgment. Yet the answer created a deeper crisis. Habakkuk had asked why God allowed wickedness to continue. Now he had to ask why God would use an even more ruthless power to confront it. That second question reveals something important about Habakkuk. He is not satisfied with a simple explanation merely because it comes in religious language. He knows what God has said. He also knows what Babylon is, and he refuses to pretend that the tension between those two things does not exist. So he speaks again, but this time before presenting his complaint, he begins with the character of God. Are you not from everlasting, O Lord my God, my Holy One? That opening matters. Habakkuk does not begin with Babylon. He begins with God. Before he asks what God is doing, he reminds himself of who God is. God is everlasting. He is not a temporary ruler reacting to events beyond his control. He did not rise to power because another empire fell. He does not depend upon alliances. He does not need armies to preserve his throne. The nations may change from generation to generation, but God does not become old with them. Assyria can rise and fall. Egypt can expand and retreat. Babylon can appear suddenly upon the stage of history. But none of these powers existed before God, and none will survive him. Habakkuk also calls him holy. That is where the difficulty sharpens. If God were morally unpredictable, Babylon's rise would not be surprising. If God were simply another ancient deity whose actions depended upon strength rather than righteousness, then Habakkuk would have no reason to protest. But the prophet believes God is holy. He believes evil is genuinely evil because God's character gives moral reality its standard. He believes injustice matters because God is just. So when events appear inconsistent with that justice, he does not lower his understanding of God. He raises the question. This is one of the strongest patterns in Habakkuk's faith. He argues from what he knows about God toward what he cannot understand about history. He does not argue from history toward the conclusion that God must be untrustworthy. That distinction will eventually shape the entire movement of the book. Habakkuk appears to understand that the Chaldeans have been appointed for judgment and correction. Judah is not innocent. The prophet has already made that clear. Violence exists among his own people. Law has been weakened. Justice is being distorted. The wicked surround the righteous. So Habakkuk is not trying to defend Judah from all accountability. His question is comparative. How can a nation more wicked than Judah become the instrument used against Judah? He asks why God looks upon those who act treacherously, why remain silent when the wicked devour someone more righteous than themselves. The phrase is carefully framed. Habakkuk does not claim that Judah is perfectly righteous. He says Babylon is worse. That is the tension. The judgment may be deserved. The instrument seems morally shocking. This raises a question that reaches beyond Habakkuk's own generation. Can God use an unjust ruler without declaring that ruler just? Can God use the decisions of violent people while still condemning their violence? Can a nation play a role in divine judgment and still become the object of divine judgment? Habakkuk is forced to consider all three questions at once, and the answer unfolding through the book will be yes. But he is not there yet. At this point, all he can see is the conqueror. He looks at Babylon and sees a people capable of swallowing nations. To communicate the horror of that power, Habakkuk uses the image of the sea. He says humanity has become like fish. The image is intentionally unsettling. Fish in the open sea do not possess fortified walls. They do not create military alliances. They do not negotiate treaties. They can be gathered, caught, dragged, collected. That is how imperial conquest appears in Habakkuk's imagination. Entire peoples are reduced to prey. The conqueror brings them up with a hook. He drags them into a net. He gathers them into a dragnet. Then he rejoices. This is not merely military victory, it is dehumanization. The nations are no longer regarded as communities. The conqueror sees only what can be captured. A city is territory. A population is labor. A defeated king is a trophy. A harvest is tribute. A nation becomes another addition to the net. Habakkuk understands the danger of a political system in which success itself becomes the highest moral standard. If conquest is always justified by the fact that it succeeds, then nothing restrains the conqueror except a stronger conqueror. Babylon's army can begin to function like a god. Habakkuk says that the conqueror sacrifices to his net and burns incense to his dragnet. The image is almost absurd, and that is precisely why it is powerful. The net is only a tool. But because the tool produces wealth and victory, the conqueror begins to treat it as the source of life. His military strength becomes sacred. His strategy becomes sacred. His weapons become sacred. His success becomes sacred. The empire worships its own capacity to dominate. This is idolatry, without necessarily requiring a carved statue. Anything can become an idol when a person begins to trust the gift, the instrument, or the power more than the one who ultimately rules over history. Babylon's danger is not only that it possesses strength, its danger is that it trusts strength. This connects directly with something God has already revealed. The proud person is not upright within. Pride distorts the soul because it convinces human beings that temporary power is permanent. Babylon looks at its victories and assumes they prove its greatness. Habakkuk looks at those same victories and asks whether they can continue forever. Will he therefore keep on emptying his net and mercilessly killing nations forever? That question reaches the heart of empire. Where does expansion stop? If wealth increases through conquest, what reason does the conqueror have to stop conquering? If each defeated people strengthens the empire, why leave the next people alone? If violence is rewarded with territory, tribute, and fear, then violence itself begins to look rational. Habakkuk is not merely frightened by Babylon's present strength, he is frightened by the logic of Babylonian power. The appetite of empire can become endless. One victory demands another. One border becomes insufficient. One captured city produces confidence for the next campaign. One defeated king proves that another king can be defeated. The conqueror becomes like a person whose hunger grows every time he eats. This is why pride and greed will later become central themes in the judgments pronounced against Babylon. The empire's problem is not only what it has done, it is what it believes about itself. It believes it has the right to gather nations. It believes its strength creates its legitimacy. It believes its success protects it from judgment. Habakkuk cannot accept that. If God truly is holy, then Babylon cannot be beyond accountability. If God truly is sovereign, then Babylon's military power cannot become ultimate. If God truly governs nations, then the net cannot remain full forever. But Habakkuk does not know how these truths will fit together. So he takes his stand. I will stand at my watchpost. It is one of the defining images of the book. Habakkuk does not run from the question. He does not silence himself. But neither does he continue speaking endlessly. He has complained. Now he waits. He stations himself as though on a tower above a fortified wall. The watchman is not asleep. He is alert. He scans the horizon. His position requires patience because most moments contain no obvious change. The road may remain empty for hours. The hills may look exactly as they looked before. But the watchman waits because the fact that he cannot yet see movement does not mean movement will never come. Habakkuk turns this posture into an act of spiritual expectation. He will look to see what God will say. This is striking language because hearing is described through seeing. He waits for an answer with the intensity of someone watching the horizon for the first sign of an approaching messenger. There is tension in that waiting. Habakkuk believes an answer will come, but he does not know whether that answer will confirm his reasoning or challenge it. In fact, he seems prepared for correction. That humility is essential. A person can ask God a difficult question while still assuming that God must agree with every conclusion behind the question. Habakkuk does something different. He takes his complaint seriously, but he also knows his own perspective is limited. He is a prophet. He has received revelation. Yet he still waits for God to show him what he cannot see. This is not intellectual surrender, it is intellectual humility. Habakkuk has observed real evil. His moral concern is not imaginary. Babylon truly is violent. Judah truly is corrupt. The tension truly exists. But Habakkuk does not assume that because he sees part of the truth, he sees all of it. The watchtower becomes the place where honest questioning and humility meet. And then God answers. The response begins with a command. Write the vision, make it plain. The message must be recorded clearly. This is not an answer meant only to settle Habakkuk's private emotions. It belongs to a larger audience. The vision concerns an appointed time. It is moving toward fulfillment. It will not prove false. And if it seems to delay, Habakkuk is told to wait. The language of waiting appears again. Habakkuk has already waited for an answer. Now he is told that even after receiving the answer, he may still have to wait for its fulfillment. This is more difficult than receiving information. It requires living between revelation and fulfillment. God tells him that what has been announced will come. The apparent delay is not evidence that God has lost control. The timeline belongs to an appointed purpose. This idea directly confronts one of Habakkuk's deepest fears. Babylon appears immediate. Judgment upon Babylon may appear distant. The conqueror's victories can be seen. The limit upon those victories cannot yet be seen. Habakkuk is being asked to trust that the unseen limit is just as real as the visible army. That is the environment in which one of the most important statements in the book appears. The proud one is contrasted with the righteous. The proud person is swollen with self-confidence. His inner life is not straight. But the righteous will live by his faithfulness, or in the familiar wording carried through many English translations, the righteous shall live by faith. Before this statement becomes part of Paul's arguments in the New Testament, it belongs here. It belongs on the edge of crisis. It belongs between Babylon's rise and Babylon's eventual fall. It belongs in the experience of people who may not see justice immediately. To live by faith in Habakkuk is not to close one's eyes to history. It is to see history honestly and still refuse to make visible power the final authority. Babylon lives by conquest. The righteous live by faithfulness. Babylon builds identity around what it can seize. The righteous depend upon God. Babylon interprets delay as permission. The righteous interpret delay as a call to endurance. Babylon's confidence rises with every victory. The righteous person's confidence rests somewhere deeper than victory. This contrast is not abstract theology. It is a survival principle for the age Habakkuk is entering. Judah's future will not be stable. Political circumstances will not provide a permanent foundation. Military alliances will not guarantee security. The righteous person will have to live through a world where the wrong people may appear to win for a time. Faithfulness means continuing to belong to God in that world. That does not require calling evil good. It does not require pretending judgment is painless. It does not mean predicting exactly when circumstances will improve. It means refusing to let circumstances redefine the character of God. This is where Habakkuk's internal journey begins to change. His first complaint was driven by what he saw. His second complaint was driven by the tension between what he saw and what he knew about God. The answer now teaches him to live from what he knows about God while the historical outcome is still incomplete. That movement will eventually become the foundation of his final prayer. But before Habakkuk can reach that point, the arrogance of Babylon must be exposed. The vision does not simply tell him trust, it also explains why Babylon's power cannot last. The empire's own character contains the reason for its judgment. Its appetite is compared to death itself. It is never satisfied. It gathers nations. It accumulates peoples. It takes what does not belong to it. It builds security from the ruin of others. It imagines that enough wealth can place its household beyond danger. It builds cities through bloodshed. It humiliates others. It turns violence into spectacle. It trusts idols unable to speak. The conqueror appears glorious from the outside, but the vision looks beneath that glory. The palace may be impressive. The walls may be thick. The army may be disciplined. The treasury may be full. But if the entire structure depends upon greed, bloodshed, arrogance, and idolatry, then its apparent strength hides a moral weakness. Habakkuk is about to hear 5 pronouncements of woe. Each one will expose a different dimension of the oppressor's power. The first will confront plunder. The second will confront unjust gain and false security. The third will confront cities built through blood. The fourth will confront humiliation and shame. The fifth will confront idolatry. Together, they will answer Habakkuk's question about whether Babylon can continue emptying its net forever. No, the net has a limit. The empire has an appointed end. The one who gathers nations will eventually face the testimony of those nations. The one who takes will be taken from. The one who builds security through exploitation will discover that stolen foundations do not provide lasting safety. The one who spreads violence will find that violence does not disappear simply because the victor controls the story. The one who trusts idols will finally stand before the living God. Habakkuk has not yet seen any of this happen. That is crucial. The vision precedes the visible outcome. Faith must therefore exist before confirmation. If Habakkuk could watch Babylon fall immediately, waiting would not be necessary. If justice operated according to his preferred schedule, faith would require far less endurance. But he is called to stand between promise and fulfillment. That is where the righteous live by faith. The prophet who once cried, "How long?" now receives an answer that includes the command to wait. Not because evil does not matter, because the appointed time has not yet arrived. Not because Babylon is innocent, because Babylon's judgment belongs to God. Not because Habakkuk's questions were wrong, because those questions were never the end of the journey. Something deeper is beginning. Habakkuk is learning that faith is not the possession of complete explanations. It is the decision to remain faithful while the explanation is still unfolding. And now from the watchtower, his attention shifts. He had been staring at Babylon's net. God directs him toward Babylon's future. The empire that looked like the answer to Judah's corruption is about to become the subject of its own indictment. One by one, the foundations of imperial pride will be exposed. And when the final woe is spoken, Habakkuk will discover that the deepest contrast in this story is not simply between Judah and Babylon. It is between every form of human pride that tries to make itself ultimate and the living God before whom the whole earth must eventually be silent. The watchtower had given Habakkuk perspective, but perspective did not remove the danger. Babylon was still rising. Judah was still vulnerable. The empire's armies were still advancing through the ancient Near East. The difference was that Habakkuk had now been shown something the conqueror could not see. Babylon's success had a limit. Its victories were not proof of innocence. Its power was not permanent, and the empire that believed it could gather nations without consequence was already moving toward judgment. God's answer now takes the form of a taunt. The peoples Babylon has conquered will not remain silent forever. The victims will speak. The plundered will answer the plunderer. Those who've been treated like objects in an imperial net will become witnesses against the empire that consumed them. And then comes a series of 5 warnings. 5 woes. Each one exposes a different layer of Babylon's pride. Together, they reveal something larger than the fate of a single ancient empire. They show what happens when power is separated from justice. The first woe confronts greed. The second confronts false security. The third confronts bloodshed. The fourth confronts humiliation and exploitation. The fifth confronts idolatry. The empire appears strongest at the very moment its moral collapse is being announced. That is one of the great reversals in Habakkuk. From the ground, Babylon looks unstoppable. From the perspective of God's judgment, it is already accountable. The first woe begins with plunder. Woe to him who piles up stolen goods. Babylon had expanded by taking land, wealth, cities, treasures, tribute, human beings. In the logic of conquest, accumulation becomes evidence of greatness. The more an empire possesses, the more powerful it appears. But the vision turns the logic upside down. What Babylon calls wealth is also evidence. Every stolen possession points backward to someone who lost it. Every treasure has a history. Every conquered city has survivors. Every tribute payment represents domination. Every captive carries a memory. The conqueror sees a growing treasury. God sees a growing case against the conqueror. Habakkuk is told that the creditors will eventually rise. Those who have been plundered will awaken. The plunderer will become plunder. The reversal is deliberate. Babylon has treated nations as resources to be harvested. But the same principle of violence upon which it built its strength will turn against it. This does not mean every victim will personally witness the full reversal. Habakkuk is not given a simple promise that every individual injustice will be visibly corrected within the lifetime of the sufferer. The message is larger. The structure of predatory power will not endure forever. The empire may delay accountability, it cannot abolish accountability. This is the first answer to Habakkuk's fear that Babylon will keep emptying its net without end. No, there will be a reckoning. The second woe moves from greed to security. Woe to him who gets evil gain for his house. The image changes. Now the conqueror is not merely accumulating, he is building. He wants to place his nest high, out of reach, beyond danger. The language suggests the instinct of someone who knows somewhere beneath his confidence that what he has built may create enemies. So he builds higher, he strengthens defenses, he gathers more wealth. He increases political control. He attempts to secure his dynasty. The goal is not simply luxury, it is invulnerability. This is one of the oldest dreams of power. Acquire enough, control enough, build enough, rise high enough, then no one can touch you. But Habakkuk exposes the contradiction. Babylon is trying to protect itself from the consequences of the very actions it used to become powerful. Its security is built from the resentment of the conquered. Its wealth comes from exploitation. Its expansion creates enemies. Its confidence requires constant reinforcement because the foundations are unstable. The empire imagines that the higher it builds, the safer it becomes. The vision says the opposite. By destroying many peoples, Babylon has shamed its own house. The crime intended to secure the dynasty becomes the evidence that condemns it. Even the materials of the building become witnesses. The stone cries out from the wall. The beam answers from the woodwork. It is poetic language, but the meaning is clear. The empire cannot hide its history behind architecture. A palace can be beautiful and still contain the memory of exploitation. A wall can look impressive and still represent forced labor, stolen wealth, or bloodshed. A monument can celebrate victory while silently testifying to what that victory cost. Habakkuk's vision refuses to separate civilization from the means used to build it. The empire may control the official story. The stones remember another story. Then comes the third woe. Woe to him who builds a city with bloodshed and establishes a town by injustice. The language becomes even more direct. Blood is in the foundation. Babylon's cities may appear magnificent, its buildings may seem permanent, its rulers may boast in engineering walls, temples, military roads, and imperial organization. But magnificence cannot make injustice righteous. Human beings are often impressed by scale. A massive city seems to prove greatness. A powerful army seems to prove legitimacy. A long list of victories seems to prove destiny. Habakkuk is forced to see beneath the surface. What did it cost? Who died? Who was displaced? Who labored? Who lost land? Who was carried away? Who had no choice? A civilization cannot be morally evaluated only by what it builds. The means matter. The third woe declares that cities built through blood cannot become eternal simply because their walls are strong. Then the vision suddenly expands beyond Babylon. The peoples labor for what will be consumed by fire. Nations exhaust themselves for nothing. It is a sweeping statement about human ambition detached from God. People pour generations into systems they imagine will last forever. Dynasties build. Empires expand. Rulers engrave their names into stone. Armies defend borders. Treasuries accumulate gold. And eventually another generation walks among ruins. The world is full of the remains of powers that once believed they could not fall. But Habakkuk does not leave the vision in futility. Against the temporary glory of empire comes a far greater promise. The earth will be filled with the knowledge of the glory of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. This is one of the most expansive statements in the book. Babylon wants to fill the earth with the evidence of Babylonian power. God declares that the earth belongs to a different glory. The contrast is enormous. An empire measures greatness by territory. God's glory cannot be contained by territory. An empire must march from city to city. God does not need conquest in order to remain sovereign. Babylon's monuments can fall. God's glory is not dependent upon monuments. The empire that currently dominates Habakkuk's horizon is placed inside a much larger vision. Babylon is temporary. God's purposes are not. This does not immediately remove the suffering Habakkuk fears, but it changes the scale through which he understands it. The present empire is not the final reality. That truth becomes increasingly important as the fourth woe begins. Now the subject is humiliation. The text condemns one who makes neighbors drink in order to gaze upon their nakedness. The imagery combines intoxication, exploitation, and shame. Babylon's violence is not only about taking territory, it includes the degradation of conquered peoples. Ancient conquest could involve the public humiliation of enemies, the stripping away of status, forced submission, and displays designed to demonstrate that the defeated had no power left. Habakkuk's language captures the cruelty behind such domination. The oppressor does not merely defeat, he humiliates. He turns another person's vulnerability into entertainment or proof of superiority. But once again, the vision reverses the direction. The one who gives the cup will receive a cup. The one who produces shame will be covered with shame. Violence will return upon the violent. The image of the cup becomes a symbol of judgment. Babylon has made others drink humiliation. Now Babylon will drink. Its glory will be exposed as disgrace. The empire that controlled the gaze of the world will itself become an object of judgment. There is a moral symmetry to these woes. The punishment often echoes the crime. You plundered, you will be plundered. You built false security. Your own house testifies against you. You built with blood. Your achievement will not endure. You humiliated others. Shame will return upon you. This is not random punishment. It is the unveiling of what the empire has become. Then Habakkuk's vision mentions violence done to Lebanon and destruction inflicted upon animals. The language reminds the listener that imperial expansion harms more than kings and armies. War affects land, forests, animals, agriculture, villages, ordinary people. Violence radiates outward. A military campaign can be described in a royal inscription as a victory. For those living in its path, it may mean the destruction of homes, crops, livestock, and entire local ecosystems. Habakkuk's indictment is broad enough to see those consequences. The conqueror cannot hide behind the language of strategy. Bloodshed remains bloodshed. Then comes the final woe. The fifth warning moves from political power to worship. What value is an idol carved by a craftsman? The question sounds almost mocking. A human being shapes an object. Then the human being trusts the object. Hands create it. Then those same hands bow before it. The idol cannot speak. It cannot teach. It cannot breathe. It cannot answer. Yet people place confidence in it. This is where Babylon's external violence and internal theology meet. Idolatry is not merely one religious practice among others within the empire. It represents a deeper distortion. The created thing is treated as ultimate. Human beings give sacred authority to what they themselves have made. Earlier, Habakkuk described Babylon as sacrificing to its net. Now that theme reaches its full expression. Whether the object is a carved idol, military strength, wealth, political power, or the machinery of empire, the pattern is similar. Human beings trust what their own hands have produced. Then they become servants of it. Babylon believes its gods, its armies, and its power guarantee its future. But the prophet has already been shown that its future is limited. The idol cannot warn Babylon. It cannot save Babylon. It cannot speak when judgment comes. It cannot alter the appointed time. The final contrast is one of the most powerful transitions in the book. The idols are silent because they are lifeless. Then Habakkuk declares, "But the Lord is in his holy temple." The silence changes meaning. At the beginning of the book, Habakkuk feared God's silence. He cried out and wondered why heaven seemed inactive. Now, at the end of the series of woes, silence becomes the appropriate response of the earth before God. Let all the earth keep silence before him. This is not the silence of divine absence, it is the silence of human awe. At the beginning, the prophet asks why God is not speaking. Now the nations are told to stop speaking before God. What has changed? Not yet the political situation. Babylon has not vanished. Judah has not escaped the coming crisis. The armies have not turned around. What has changed is perspective. The conqueror is no longer the largest presence in the story. God is. Babylon's noise, its marching armies, its commands, its boasts, its victories has dominated the horizon. But the vision ends with the image of God in his holy temple. The true center of reality is not Babylon's throne room. It is not Jerusalem's political court. It is not Egypt's palace. It is not the battlefield. The Lord reigns. That truth does not trivialize suffering. Habakkuk will soon make that clear. In fact, the next movement of the book becomes even more personal. The prophet has heard that Babylon will be judged. He has heard that pride will fail. He has heard that the righteous must live by faith. He has heard that God's glory will fill the earth. He has heard that every idol is ultimately powerless. But knowing the final direction of history does not mean the road there will be painless. Judah still faces judgment. An empire can be temporary and still destroy a city. A ruler can be doomed and still kill people before his fall. An army can be under God's authority and still terrify those standing in its path. This is where easy answers fail. Habakkuk has received a theological answer. Now he must live emotionally inside its consequences. There is a difference between saying Babylon will not last forever and hearing the footsteps of Babylonian soldiers approaching. There is a difference between believing that God will judge evil someday and watching a harvest disappear today. There is a difference between affirming divine sovereignty in principle and trusting divine sovereignty when the future of your own nation appears to be collapsing. Habakkuk is about to cross that distance. The book now changes form. The argument gives way to prayer. The prophet who questioned God begins to remember God. His attention moves backward into the history of divine action. He remembers the God who came in power, the God whose glory covered the heavens, the God before whom mountains trembled, the God who acted for the salvation of his people. The imagery will become vast, poetic, and almost overwhelming. But before that prayer reaches confidence, it will pass through fear. Habakkuk will hear the threat, and his body will respond. His lips will tremble. Weakness will enter his bones. He will feel himself shaking. This is important because the faith at the end of the book is not the faith of a man who feels no fear. It is the faith of a man who trembles and still chooses trust. The 5 woes have answered one question. Babylon is not beyond judgment. But another question remains. What happens to faith while waiting for that judgment? What happens when the righteous must live through the interval between the promise and its fulfillment? What happens when the fig tree itself stops blooming? Habakkuk has heard the verdict against Babylon. Now the crisis moves from the empire outside him to the fear inside him. And before his faith becomes unshakable, everything he can see will appear capable of being shaken. The argument had reached its limit. Habakkuk had questioned God. God had answered. Habakkuk had questioned again. And God had shown him that Babylon's rise would not become Babylon's permanent victory. The proud would not endure forever. The violent would answer for violence. The plunderer would eventually be plundered. The empire that built its strength through bloodshed would discover that power cannot protect anyone from the judgment of God. But Habakkuk still had to live in the space between that promise and its fulfillment. That is where the book changes. The prophet stops arguing, and he begins to pray. The 3rd chapter opens by identifying what follows as a prayer of Habakkuk the prophet. This is not a minor transition. The first 2 chapters largely move through complaint and divine response. The 3rd chapter turns those truths into worship. Habakkuk has not suddenly received every detail he wanted. He still does not know exactly how every event will unfold. He does not know how much Judah will suffer. He does not know how many people will live through the coming upheaval. He does not know how long Babylon will appear dominant before its own judgment comes. But he knows enough to pray differently. He begins with something simple. He has heard. O Lord, I have heard the report of you. The wording suggests memory, reputation, the record of what God has done. Habakkuk looks at his present crisis by remembering the God who acted in the past. This is one of the most important movements in biblical faith. When the future is uncertain, memory becomes a form of spiritual resistance. Habakkuk cannot yet see deliverance, so he remembers deliverance. He cannot yet see Babylon judged, so he remembers that God has acted in history before. He cannot control the political future of Judah, so he returns to the character of the one who has governed nations long before Babylon appeared. The prophet asks God to renew his work, to make it known again. And then comes a request that reveals how deeply Habakkuk has changed. In wrath, remember mercy. He does not say there should be no judgment. He has already acknowledged Judah's guilt. He has seen too much corruption to pretend the nation has done nothing wrong. Instead, he asks that judgment itself not erase mercy. This is not an attempt to manipulate God emotionally. It is a plea rooted in what Scripture repeatedly reveals about God. Justice and mercy are not competing deities. Habakkuk does not have to choose one and deny the other. He can acknowledge that judgment is deserved and still ask for compassion. That prayer is mature because it no longer demands that God act according to Habakkuk's first expectations. At the beginning of the book, Habakkuk effectively asked, "Why do you not stop this now?" He prays, "As you act, remember mercy." The shift is profound. He is no longer asking God to fit inside his preferred solution. He is asking God to remain consistent with his own character. Then the prayer becomes poetic. The scale expands. Habakkuk begins to describe God in imagery drawn from divine appearances and acts of deliverance. God comes from Teman, the Holy One from Mount Paran. These geographic references point southward toward regions associated with Israel's wilderness story and the memory of Sinai. Habakkuk's language appears to reach backward into the foundational history of Israel. The God he invokes is the God who came near to a people in the wilderness, the God who revealed himself, the God who led, the God who acted, the God whose presence transformed frightened slaves into a covenant people. Habakkuk's present world is dominated by Babylon. His prayer deliberately enters an older world. Before Babylon existed as Habakkuk knew it, God was already God. Before Judah had kings, God acted. Before Jerusalem had a temple, God revealed his glory. Before Israel possessed land, God was faithful. This backward movement is not nostalgia. It is theological orientation. Habakkuk is placing the newest empire inside the oldest reality. God's splendor covers the heavens. The earth is filled with his praise. Brightness flashes like light. Power is hidden in his hand. The language is majestic because the prophet needs an image of God large enough to confront the image of Babylon that has filled his imagination. Earlier, the Chaldeans seemed vast. Their horses were swift. Their armies covered territory. Their strength terrified nations. But Habakkuk 3 deliberately magnifies God until imperial power becomes small by comparison. Before him, plague and pestilence are pictured as moving. He stands, and the earth shakes. He looks, and nations tremble. Ancient mountains are shattered. Everlasting hills sink down. The poetic imagery does not mean the chapter is giving a literal travel diary of God moving physically across a map. This is exalted prophetic poetry. Habakkuk is using the language of creation, exodus, storm warfare, and divine appearance to describe the overwhelming majesty of God. The point is not to identify every poetic image with one single historical event. The point is that creation itself cannot stand indifferent before its creator. Mountains that seem permanent are not permanent before him. Nations that seem powerful are not powerful before him. And that contrast is exactly what Habakkuk needs to remember. Babylon looks permanent because Habakkuk is living inside Babylon's generation. But mountains look permanent too, and even mountains tremble before God. The prayer then asks whether God is angry with rivers, whether his wrath is against the streams, whether his rage is directed at the sea as he rides with horses and victorious chariots. These questions remind the listener that natural elements in biblical poetry can become part of the imagery of God's saving power. The sea is not God's true enemy. The rivers are not moral rebels. The point is that no barrier in creation can prevent God from carrying out his purposes. Israel's story had been shaped by impossible barriers. The waters of the Red Sea stood between an enslaved people and freedom. The Jordan stood before entry into the land. The wilderness appeared incapable of sustaining a nation. Again and again, the circumstances looked stronger than the people. But Habakkuk remembers a God whose power is not limited by the obstacle. His bow is uncovered. His weapons are pictured as ready. The earth is split by rivers. Mountains see him and writhe. Floodwaters sweep by. The deep gives its voice. The sun and moon are described as standing still in their places at the flash of divine weapons. The poetry becomes cosmic. Habakkuk does not merely need to believe that God is stronger than Babylon. He needs to remember that Babylon itself exists inside a creation over which God remains sovereign. The empire does not control the sun. It does not command mountains. It did not create the earth beneath its armies. Its kings may issue decrees, but their authority is microscopic compared with the Creator's. This does not mean military danger is imaginary. Habakkuk will soon tremble at the thought of invasion, but fear changes when the feared object is placed inside a larger reality. Babylon may be stronger than Judah. Babylon is not stronger than God. That distinction is everything. Habakkuk then moves toward the purpose of divine action. God marches through the earth. He threshes nations, but the climax is not destruction for destruction's sake. You went out for the salvation of your people. Salvation. That word changes the emotional center of the prayer. Habakkuk remembers that when God acted powerfully in Israel's past judgment and deliverance often appeared together. Egypt experienced judgment. Israel experienced liberation. The sea became destruction for one army and a pathway of escape for another people. Divine intervention can therefore appear very different depending upon where someone stands in relation to God's purposes. Habakkuk is beginning to see his own crisis through that pattern. Judgment is coming. But judgment is not the end of God's covenant faithfulness. Babylon will not erase the story. The promise will not vanish simply because Jerusalem faces danger. God has acted to save before. Habakkuk can therefore pray for salvation again. The chapter speaks of God crushing the head of the wicked house and laying bare its foundation. The imagery is severe. Oppressive power is not merely pushed backward, its foundation is exposed. This connects directly with the 5 woes. Babylon's problem is not superficial. Its entire system is built upon pride, exploitation, and violence. To judge the system means reaching its foundations. Habakkuk describes enemy warriors coming like a whirlwind to scatter rejoicing as though they can devour the poor in secret. The picture is recognizable. Power enjoys attacking those who appear unable to resist. The poor seem easy to consume. The isolated seem easy to crush. The empire believes strength makes victory inevitable, but Habakkuk remembers that human strength has failed before. God marched through the sea, through the surging waters. The prayer echoes with memories larger than Habakkuk's own lifetime. He was not present at the Exodus. He did not stand with Moses. He did not walk through the sea. He did not watch Pharaoh's army disappear. But those events belong to the spiritual memory of Israel. This is another important dimension of biblical faith. A generation can draw confidence from acts of God it did not personally witness, because those acts reveal something enduring about God's character. Habakkuk does not invent a new God for his crisis. He returns to the God already revealed. And yet memory does not make him emotionally invulnerable. This is where the prayer becomes intensely personal. Habakkuk hears, and his body trembles. His lips quiver. Decay enters his bones. His legs shake beneath him. The prophet who has just described mountains trembling now trembles himself. This is one of the most important details in the entire book. Habakkuk's growing faith does not remove fear from his nervous system. He understands more, he trusts more, and he is still afraid. Biblical courage is not always the absence of trembling. Sometimes it is the ability to remain faithful while trembling. Habakkuk knows that the day of trouble is coming upon the invading nation. The wording points toward a future reversal. Babylon will face trouble, but Habakkuk may still have to endure trouble before that happens. This is where easy religious slogans would fail him. He cannot simply say, God will judge Babylon, and therefore assume nothing painful will happen first. The book has never promised that. Judah's corruption has consequences. History will not move around Habakkuk simply because he understands the theology correctly. He may still see war. He may still see economic devastation. He may still see fear spread through communities. He may still watch the structures of ordinary life begin to break. He waits quietly for the day of distress to come against the people who invade. Quietly. That word deserves attention. Habakkuk began with noise. How long? Why? He cried out. He protested. He argued. Now he waits quietly. But this silence is not the suppression of questions. His questions have been taken seriously. His silence now has a different quality. He has spoken. God has answered. The prophet has remembered. And now he waits without demanding that history move faster simply to make him more comfortable. This is one of the greatest transformations in the book. Habakkuk begins unable to tolerate the apparent delay of justice. He ends willing to wait for the appointed time, not because justice matters less, because his confidence in God has become greater. Still, one final test remains. So far, Habakkuk has spoken of nations, armies, judgment, history, mountains, seas, empires. These are enormous categories. But faith becomes most personal when the crisis reaches ordinary life. What happens when the fields fail? What happens when food disappears? What happens when the national crisis enters the kitchen? What happens when theology becomes hunger? Ancient Judah depended heavily upon agriculture. A fig tree was not merely decorative. Vines were not merely landscape. Olive trees were not ornamental. Fields were not background scenery. Sheep and cattle were not abstract symbols. They represented food, oil, trade, clothing, work, income, security, continuity. The agricultural cycle was part of life itself. A failed harvest could mean far more than economic inconvenience. It could mean desperation. And Habakkuk is about to imagine the collapse of that entire system. The fig tree may not blossom. There may be no fruit on the vines. The olive crop may fail. The fields may produce no food. The flock may disappear from the fold. There may be no cattle in the stalls. This is not one bad day. It is a picture of cascading loss. Fruit, oil, grain, livestock, the resources that sustain an agricultural society disappear one after another. And only then will Habakkuk make his final declaration. That order matters. He does not say he will rejoice because he expects the fig tree to bloom tomorrow. He does not say he will rejoice because Babylon will definitely turn around before reaching Judah. He does not say he will rejoice because suffering is unreal. He looks directly at the possibility of devastation and prepares to say, yet. That single word will carry the weight of the entire book. Violence exists. Yet. Judgment is coming. Yet. Babylon is rising. Yet. The harvest may fail. Yet. The animals may disappear. Yet. The prophet may tremble. Yet. Habakkuk began his journey asking how faith could survive when God seemed silent. He is about to discover that faith can survive even when the visible supports of life themselves disappear. And when he finally speaks, the circumstances will not have changed. The empire will still exist. The threat will still be real. The future will still contain pain. But Habakkuk will no longer measure God's faithfulness by whether the vineyard is full. The argument is ending. The prayer is reaching its summit, and the prophet who once stood watching for an answer is about to stand upon something far stronger than an answer to every question. He is about to stand upon God Himself. Habakkuk had moved from protest to prayer, but the final transformation was not complete. He had learned that Babylon would not endure forever. He had learned that pride carries judgment within itself. He had remembered the God of Israel's past the God who acted in power, the God before whom mountains trembled, the God whose purposes could not be stopped by rivers, armies, or empires. He had even learned to wait. Yet there is a difference between understanding that God is sovereign and discovering whether your own faith can survive when everything you depend upon begins to disappear. That is the test Habakkuk now faces. The final verses of his prayer are some of the most powerful words in the entire prophetic literature because they do not arise from comfort. They arise from anticipated loss. Habakkuk does not imagine an easy future. He does not picture Judah suddenly escaping all consequences. He does not pretend the Babylonian threat has vanished. He looks directly at the possibility that the structures sustaining ordinary life could collapse. And this is where his faith becomes personal. For much of the book, the crisis has operated at the level of nations. Judah, Babylon, kings, armies, cities, judgment. But ordinary people do not experience history only through the names of empires. They experience it through bread, through work, through harvests, through animals, through whether there is enough food for a household, through whether the land can still sustain life. A war may be described in a royal chronicle as a campaign. To a farmer, it may mean a burned field. To a mother, it may mean an empty storage jar. To a shepherd, it may mean the disappearance of the flock. To a village, it may mean the collapse of the economic rhythms that have sustained generations. Habakkuk understands this, and so the final movement of his prayer does not begin with palaces or battlefields. It begins with a fig tree. Though the fig tree does not bud, the image is quiet, almost ordinary. That is precisely why it carries such force. The fig tree belonged to the landscape of daily life. Its fruit mattered. Its cycle mattered. A tree that failed to blossom represented more than aesthetic disappointment. It was one sign that the normal order of provision was breaking. Then Habakkuk adds another loss. There are no grapes on the vines. Vineyards required years of labor and care. They were part of agriculture, trade food production, and the social life of the land. A failed vine meant another source of abundance disappearing. Then another. The olive crop fails. Olive oil was deeply woven into ancient life. It could be used for food, light commerce, and other daily purposes. A failed olive harvest was not an inconvenience around the edges of society. It cut into the functioning of the household and economy. Then the fields fail. The fields produce no food. Now the picture becomes even darker. Grain production was fundamental. If vineyards failed, life became harder. If olive trees failed, resources were lost. But if fields produced no food, the crisis approached hunger. Habakkuk continues, "There are no sheep in the pen, then no cattle in the stalls." The losses now cover the entire agricultural system. Fruit trees, vineyards, olives, fields, flocks, herds. Each line removes another visible source of security. This is not a poetic list chosen at random. It is cumulative. Habakkuk imagines life stripped down layer by layer. The orchard fails, the vineyard fails, the oil fails, the grain fails, the sheep disappear, the cattle are gone. What remains? That is the question hidden beneath the passage. What remains when the things a person normally points to as evidence of blessing are no longer present? What happens to faith when prosperity cannot support it? What happens when obedience does not produce immediate visible safety? What happens when there is nothing in the field that can reassure you? Habakkuk's answer begins with one of the most important words in the book, yet. The circumstances he described are still there. He does not cancel them. He does not revise the scenario. He does not say, but surely that will never happen. He says, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. This is where the entire book turns. At the beginning, Habakkuk's emotional stability depended heavily upon understanding what God was doing. He could not reconcile divine justice with the evil around him. Then God's answer disturbed him even more. Now, by the end of the journey, Habakkuk's faith no longer depends upon possessing a complete explanation. He has not abandoned reason. He has not stopped caring about justice. He has not forgotten Babylon. Instead, something deeper has happened. His confidence has moved from circumstances to God. There is a major difference between saying, I rejoice because the harvest is abundant, and saying, even if the harvest disappears, I will rejoice in the Lord. The first rejoices in a gift. The second rejoices in the giver, even when the gift is absent. That does not mean the gift is unimportant. Food matters, safety matters, justice matters. Habakkuk never suggests otherwise. Biblical faith does not require pretending material suffering is meaningless. The prophet has spent most of the book demonstrating exactly how seriously suffering should be taken. But suffering does not become the final authority for defining God. That is the transformation. Habakkuk began by looking at Judah and asking what the visible world said about God. Now he looks at God and uses what he knows about God to interpret the visible world. The direction has reversed. At first, injustice is happening, therefore, how can I understand God? Now God is faithful, therefore, even injustice and loss cannot be the final chapter. That does not make Habakkuk naive. He has already said his body trembles, his lips quiver, weakness enters his bones. He waits for the day of trouble. The man making this declaration is not emotionally untouched. This is not the speech of someone standing in perfect calm while everyone else suffers. He feels fear. He anticipates pain. He knows the crisis may become severe, and still he says, I will rejoice. This matters because joy in Habakkuk is not the opposite of grief. It is the refusal to allow grief to erase trust. The prophet can tremble and rejoice. He can fear what is coming and still trust the one who remains. He can acknowledge material loss without making material loss the measure of God's goodness. This is mature faith, not denial, not emotional numbness, not optimism detached from reality. Faith. Habakkuk then explains the object of that joy. He rejoices in the God of my salvation. Salvation. The word returns. Earlier in the prayer, Habakkuk remembered God going out for the salvation of his people. Now salvation becomes personal. My salvation. This does not mean Habakkuk has been promised that he personally will avoid every painful event. The text does not give him that guarantee. The confidence is larger. God is still the saving God. Babylon does not change that identity. Economic collapse does not change that identity. Fear does not change that identity. Habakkuk's inability to see the entire future does not change that identity. God is not called Savior only when the field is full. He remains the God of salvation when the field is empty. That is the foundation beneath Habakkuk's joy. Then the prayer closes with strength. The sovereign Lord is my strength. The wording places the source of Habakkuk's endurance outside himself. This is important. The final message of Habakkuk is not that strong people can survive hardship by developing enough psychological toughness. Habakkuk does not celebrate his own resilience. He does not say, I discovered that I am stronger than I thought. He says, God is his strength. The difference is theological. If Habakkuk's confidence rested in himself, then the final chapter would simply replace one form of self-reliance with another. Babylon trusts its military strength. Habakkuk would then trust his spiritual strength. But that is not the contrast. Babylon's pride says, "My power sustains me." Habakkuk's faith says, "God sustains me." That is the opposite of pride. The righteous live by faith because their life is not ultimately grounded in their own capacity. Habakkuk continues with another vivid image. God makes his feet like the feet of a deer. He enables him to walk upon the heights. The image conveys stability in dangerous terrain. An animal suited to rocky heights can move where ordinary footing appears uncertain. Habakkuk does not ask for the mountain to become flat. He speaks of receiving the strength to walk upon it. That is a fitting conclusion to his journey. At the beginning, Habakkuk wanted the landscape of history to make sense. By the end, he has learned to trust God enough to move across terrain that remains difficult. The danger is not entirely removed. The footing is still high, the path may still be steep, but he is no longer paralyzed by it. This is the faith toward which the entire book has been moving. The circumstances have not yet changed. Habakkuk has. That does not mean his questions were pointless. Without the questions, the transformation would lose its meaning. Habakkuk's final confidence is not an uninformed confidence. It is faith that has passed through confrontation. He has looked at injustice. He has looked at Babylon. He has looked at divine judgment. He has looked at the possibility of economic collapse. He has faced the hardest questions available to him, and his faith survives. More than that, it deepens. This is why the book should not be reduced to the message, "Do not question God." Habakkuk does question, repeatedly. The text preserves those questions. God answers them. The prophet is not condemned simply for asking why. His movement toward faith occurs through the conversation. The lesson is not that questions are forbidden. The lesson is that questions must eventually lead somewhere. Habakkuk brings his questions to God. He listens. He waits. He allows his perspective to be corrected. He remembers, he prays, and finally, he trusts. This is a very different path from cynicism. Cynicism asks a question but assumes no answer can be trustworthy. Habakkuk asks while remaining open to revelation. That openness changes him. At first, he wants to know how long evil will continue. God answers that judgment is coming. Then Habakkuk wants to know how Babylon can be used. God answers that Babylon itself will be judged. Then Habakkuk wants to understand how to live while waiting. God points toward faithfulness. Then the prophet prays, and the final answer is no longer merely information about Babylon. It is a new posture toward God. This is why the words, "The righteous shall live by faith," belong at the center of the book. They are not isolated from the surrounding crisis. They describe what Habakkuk himself learns to do. He lives by faith before the visible resolution arrives. He is still alive in the tension. Babylon still exists. The appointed time is still ahead. The harvest may still fail, but Habakkuk has found a way to stand. This gives the book an unusual structure. Many biblical narratives resolve tension through visible deliverance. The Red Sea opens, Goliath falls, the walls of Jericho collapse, a captive is released, an enemy is defeated. Habakkuk ends differently. The greatest resolution takes place inside the prophet before the external crisis is resolved. There is no scene at the end where Habakkuk watches Babylon collapse and says, "Now I understand." Instead, he reaches faith before the proof arrives. That is why his final declaration is so powerful. Anyone can praise after deliverance has become visible. Habakkuk learns to trust before it is visible. This does not eliminate the importance of future justice. The 5 woes still matter. Babylon will not rule forever. The appointed vision still matters. But Habakkuk no longer needs to see the empire fall before deciding whether God is trustworthy. This is the test he has passed. The first chapter asked whether Habakkuk could trust a God who appeared silent. The second crisis asked whether he could trust a God whose answer was frightening. The final crisis asks whether he can trust God if the future becomes materially devastating. His answer is yes. Not because he has become indifferent to suffering, because his understanding of God has become greater than his dependence upon immediate circumstances. There is another subtle transformation here. At the beginning, Habakkuk repeatedly focuses upon what God has not yet done. Why have you not saved? Why do you tolerate? Why do you remain silent? By chapter 3, he focuses upon what God has already done. He remembers the past acts of divine power. That memory becomes the bridge toward future trust. This pattern is important throughout Scripture. Biblical faith often looks backward in order to move forward. Israel remembers the Exodus. The Psalms remember God's mighty acts. The prophets remember covenant faithfulness. The New Testament repeatedly remembers the death and resurrection of Jesus as the decisive event through which present suffering and future hope are interpreted. Habakkuk belongs to that larger pattern. Memory prevents present circumstances from becoming the whole story. If Habakkuk looked only at Babylon, Babylon would appear enormous. If he looked only at failed harvests, scarcity would appear ultimate. But when he remembers God's acts across generations, the present moment becomes one chapter inside a much longer story. This does not shrink the pain, it expands the horizon. A crisis can feel final when someone cannot see beyond it. Habakkuk learns that God's story extends beyond the crisis. That is why the final declaration is not a celebration of suffering itself. Habakkuk does not rejoice that figs fail. He does not rejoice that people may go hungry. He does not rejoice that Babylon invades. He rejoices in God despite those things. That distinction must remain clear. The Bible does not require believers to call evil good in order to demonstrate faith. Habakkuk never does. Babylon is still violent. Judah's corruption is still corrupt. Economic devastation is still devastating. Faith does not rename them. Faith refuses to give them the final word. The prophet's strength comes from knowing that the God who rules history is larger than the chapter he currently incarcerates. This has enormous implications for the meaning of waiting. At first, waiting feels like abandonment. Habakkuk cries, "How long?" Later, waiting becomes obedience. The vision may seem delayed. Wait for it. Finally, waiting becomes confidence. Habakkuk waits quietly for the day of trouble to come upon the invader. The same external act waiting has changed spiritually. At first it is filled with frustration. Then it is filled with instruction. Finally, it is filled with trust. Habakkuk has learned how to wait, and that may be one of the deepest victories in the entire book. Babylon knows how to march. Habakkuk learns how to wait. Babylon knows how to seize. Habakkuk learns how to trust. Babylon knows how to fill its net. Habakkuk learns that life does not come from what the net can contain. Babylon builds upward in order to make itself secure. Habakkuk discovers security in God even if everything around him falls downward. Two ways of living stand opposite one another: pride and faith, self-sufficiency and dependence, conquest and trust. The difference will eventually outlast the empire itself. And now Habakkuk stands at the threshold of the great climax. The fig tree is empty, the vineyard is barren, the olive crop has failed, the fields produce nothing, the sheep are gone, the cattle are gone. Every visible support has been removed from the image. Nothing remains to distract from the central question. Is God enough? Habakkuk answers not with theory, but with worship. He will rejoice. He will find joy in the God of his salvation. He will receive strength from the Lord, and he will walk upon the heights. The prophet who began the book staring at injustice around him is now looking toward God above him. The man who demanded an explanation has become a man capable of trust before the explanation is complete. The one who once feared divine silence has learned that silence can become the place where faith listens. But Habakkuk's final words are more than the conclusion of one ancient prophet's personal struggle. They will become part of a much larger biblical conversation. Centuries later, one sentence from this small prophetic book will be taken up again. The righteous shall live by faith. Paul will use it while explaining the gospel. The letter to the Hebrews will use it while calling believers to endurance. And Habakkuk's struggle, born in the shadow of Babylon, will speak to generations living under very different empires and very different crises. Before we follow that legacy, however, the great declaration itself must be allowed to stand in full weight. Habakkuk has arrived at the moment where every visible reason for joy has been stripped away, and yet joy remains. The final battle of this book is not fought on a battlefield. It is fought over the foundation of the human heart. Can faith survive the loss of everything it once used as evidence? Habakkuk is about to answer, and his answer will become the defining legacy of his life. The book of Habakkuk reaches its greatest moment without an army changing direction. No enemy has yet fallen. No city has been restored. No harvest has returned. No political crisis has disappeared. The climax happens somewhere deeper. Habakkuk has reached the point where faith must stand without visible evidence that circumstances are improving. He has already looked outward. He has seen corruption in Judah. He has seen Babylon rising. He has seen the logic of imperial violence. He has heard the 5 woes. He has been told that pride will not endure forever. He has remembered the mighty acts of God. Now he turns inward. What remains when almost everything else is taken away? The question is not philosophical anymore. It is agricultural, economic, physical, personal. Though the fig tree should not blossom, Habakkuk begins with a tree. The image is simple, but it is not small. In the world of ancient Judah, agriculture shaped life. People depended upon rhythms they could not fully control: rain, seasons, soil, harvest. The health of the land directly affected the health of the household. A failed fig tree did not merely mean fewer pleasures. It meant one source of food and stability was gone. Then Habakkuk continues, "Nor fruit be on the vines. The vineyard is empty. Another layer of normal life disappears. Years of cultivation can end with nothing hanging from the branches. The farmer may have pruned, waited, protected, worked, and still the vine can produce no usable fruit. Then the olive fails. The produce of the olive fails." Olive trees represented another essential part of life. Oil touched food, light household use, commerce, and worship. The failure of the olive harvest presses the crisis deeper. Then the fields produce no food. Now the imagery moves closer to survival itself. If the grain fails, bread becomes uncertain. The problem is no longer one disappointing crop. The entire agricultural network begins to collapse. Then the animals disappear. The flock is cut off from the fold. There are no cattle in the stalls. Habakkuk has constructed a picture in which the visible signs of provision vanish one after another. Figs, grapes, olives, grain, sheep, cattle. Nothing in the list is abstract. Each item belongs to ordinary life. Together they describe the disappearance of the things people would normally point to when they say, "We are safe." This is why the passage is so much more than beautiful poetry. Habakkuk is asking what faith looks like after visible security has been removed. It is possible to say that God is good when the vineyard is full. It is possible to speak confidently about providence when the stalls are crowded. It is possible to thank God when the fields are abundant. But what happens when gratitude cannot be built upon abundance? What happens when the blessing one expected is absent? What happens when faith has to exist before restoration? This is the moment toward which the entire book has been moving. Habakkuk's first complaint was about what he could see: violence, injustice, corruption. His second complaint was about what he could foresee: Babylon, conquest, judgment. Now he imagines what he may personally experience: loss. And still he speaks, "Yet I will rejoice in the Lord." The power of the sentence lies in the word "yet." Habakkuk does not deny the first half. He does not say the fig tree will certainly blossom before the crisis reaches him. He does not promise himself that the vines will be restored immediately. He does not erase the empty field. He does not pretend livestock are unimportant. He places joy on the other side of loss without pretending loss is not real. That is the difference between biblical faith and denial. Denial says there is no problem. Habakkuk has spent 3 chapters naming the problem. Denial says pain should not be felt. Habakkuk has already said that his body trembles. Denial says difficult circumstances are illusions. Habakkuk describes them with painful clarity. Faith says something else. The circumstances are real, but they are not God. The crisis is real, but it is not ultimate. The visible world can be shaken without shaking the character of the one Habakkuk trusts. That is why he says, "I will take joy in the God of my salvation." He does not rejoice in devastation. He rejoices in God. That distinction is essential. There is nothing spiritually mature about celebrating starvation, nothing faithful about pretending invasion is pleasant, nothing holy about treating economic collapse as emotionally insignificant. Habakkuk does none of that. The object of his joy is not the suffering. It is God. And that means the foundation of his joy cannot be destroyed by the same events that destroy his harvest. The field can fail. God does not become unfaithful. The flock can disappear. God does not disappear. The political order can collapse. God's throne does not collapse. The prophet can lose visible evidence of security without losing the one in whom security ultimately rests. This is the breakthrough. At the beginning of the book, Habakkuk wanted circumstances to prove that God was just. By the end, his knowledge of God becomes the foundation from which he faces circumstances. He has not solved every mystery. He has relocated his trust. That is why his journey should not be described as moving from doubt to certainty in the simplistic sense. Habakkuk does not end with certainty about every historical detail. He ends with certainty about God. There is a difference. He still does not know every event that lies ahead. He has not been given the names of every ruler who will rise after Babylon. He has not received a detailed schedule of every judgment. He has not been told exactly how much suffering he personally will witness. But he has been given enough to know that Babylon is temporary pride, is accountable judgment, has an appointed time, and God remains sovereign. For Habakkuk, that becomes enough to live. This is exactly what the earlier statement meant. The righteous shall live by faith. Now the idea is no longer a line within a vision. It has become Habakkuk's own life. He is doing what the vision said the righteous must do. He is living between promise and fulfillment. He is standing where the outcome cannot yet be seen. He is refusing to imitate Babylon's way of life. Babylon trusts strength. Habakkuk trusts God. Babylon gathers what it can possess. Habakkuk rejoices even when possessions disappear. Babylon tries to build a nest beyond the reach of disaster. Habakkuk discovers security that disaster itself cannot reach. Babylon worships the instruments of its own success. Habakkuk worships the God who remains when success itself is removed. The contrast could not be sharper. One way of life says, I am secure because I have enough. The other says, I am secure because God is faithful. One says, my power sustains me. The other says, the Lord God is my strength. That declaration brings Habakkuk's transformation to completion. He does not say his personality is his strength. He does not say his ability to think positively will carry him. He does not say the righteousness of Judah will protect him. He does not even say that his prophetic office makes him untouchable. God is his strength. This means the final confidence of the book is radically dependent, and this dependence stands directly opposite Babylonian pride. The empire appears self-sufficient. Habakkuk knows he is not. Paradoxically, that makes the prophet stronger, because self-sufficiency fails when its resources fail. Dependence upon God survives the loss of resources. Habakkuk then uses one final image. God makes his feet like those of the deer. He enables him to walk upon the heights. Imagine rocky terrain, narrow ledges, uneven footing. One misplaced step could lead to a fall. To an animal adapted to such terrain, however, the height is not impossible. The image does not describe God removing the mountain. It describes God enabling Habakkuk to move upon it. That is a fitting conclusion to his struggle. At the beginning, Habakkuk wanted the terrain of history to become simple. He wanted justice to appear in a way he could immediately understand. Instead, God taught him how to walk through complexity without losing faith. The path is still difficult, but Habakkuk can walk. The danger is still real, but he can stand. The future is still uncertain, but he is no longer spiritually trapped by uncertainty. This is why the book's climax is more profound than a simple prediction that Babylon will fall. If Habakkuk's faith depended entirely upon watching Babylon collapse, then Babylon would still control his inner life. He would remain anxious until the empire disappeared. Instead, Habakkuk becomes free before the empire falls. His peace is no longer held hostage by Babylon. That is the victory. The conqueror can threaten the land. It cannot become the lord of Habakkuk's heart. The prophet has found a loyalty deeper than fear. And yet this does not mean that history no longer matters. Babylon's judgment remains important. The destruction of oppression matters. Justice matters. The righteous are not called to indifference. Habakkuk's faith is not an excuse for pretending evil does not need to be confronted. The 5 woes remain in the book precisely because God takes evil seriously. What changes is Habakkuk's understanding of timing. He no longer confuses delay with indifference. The vision has an appointed time. If it seems slow, wait. Those words have become part of him. At first, how long was almost unbearable. Now Habakkuk has learned that waiting can itself become faithful obedience. This transformation deserves to be seen step by step. First, Habakkuk sees injustice. He cries out. Then God reveals Babylon. Habakkuk recoils. Then he questions again. He waits upon the watchtower. God gives a vision. Pride will fall. The righteous must live by faith. Babylon receives 5 woes. The earth is called to silence before the Lord. Habakkuk remembers God's mighty acts. He trembles. He waits. And finally, with the possibility of complete agricultural collapse before him, he rejoices. Nothing about this journey is instant. Unshakable faith is not introduced as a personality trait Habakkuk possessed from the beginning. It is forged through encounter. Question, answer, confusion, waiting, revelation, memory, fear, and trust. That sequence matters because it prevents the story from becoming shallow. Habakkuk is not presented as a perfect believer who never struggles. Neither is he presented as a skeptic whose questions destroy faith. He's a man whose questions become part of the road toward deeper faith because he keeps bringing them before God. This gives the book unusual relevance. Many people assume that faith and questioning are opposites. Habakkuk demonstrates that they can exist in the same person. The critical issue is not whether a question is asked, it is what the person does with the question. Habakkuk could have used injustice as permission to abandon God. He does not. He brings injustice to God. He could have used the Babylonian answer as proof that God's character had changed. He does not. He returns to God's holiness. He could have interpreted delayed judgment as evidence that Babylon would rule forever. He does not. He waits for the appointed vision. He could have assumed fear meant his faith had failed. He does not. He trembles and still worships. And he could have made material abundance the final measurement of divine goodness. He does not. He imagines everything disappearing and still says yet. That word marks the distance Habakkuk has traveled. At the beginning, how long? At the end, yet I will rejoice. The first sentence demands an explanation. The second declares a relationship. And the relationship proves stronger than the unanswered details. This does not mean God never answered Habakkuk. He did. But the answer was not a complete explanation of every mystery of suffering. Instead, Habakkuk was given enough revelation to trust God through what remained unresolved. That distinction is important. Human beings often ask for comprehensive explanations. Why this event? Why this timing? Why this person? Why this nation? Why this loss? Why now? Habakkuk does not receive an answer to every possible why. He receives a vision of enough truth to continue. God judges evil. God rules nations. Pride will not last. The appointed time will come. The righteous must live by faith. God's glory is greater than empire. God remembers mercy. God has acted before. God remains the source of salvation and strength. Those truths become sufficient for the next step. This is how faith works in the book. Not possessing the entire map, having enough light to stand where God has placed you. Habakkuk's final declaration also reveals something about joy. Joy is often confused with favorable emotion produced by favorable circumstances. Habakkuk's joy is different. It is chosen in relation to God. He says, I will rejoice. There is intentionality in the wording. He cannot command the fig tree to bloom. He cannot command Babylon to disappear. He cannot command the harvest to succeed. But he can direct his worship. He can choose where ultimate confidence rests. This does not make him the controller of history. It frees him from needing to control history before he can trust. That is spiritual maturity. And the book's ending becomes even more striking when we remember where it began. The first chapter contains a prophet surrounded by noise, violence, strife, contention, the distortion of justice, the approaching sound of war, the movement of Babylonian cavalry, the mockery of kings, the taking of fortified places. Everything is unsettled. By the end, Habakkuk has found a center that does not move. The Lord God is my strength. Not the king, not Judah's military defenses, not Egypt, not an alliance, not the harvest, not the flock, not his own understanding. God. That is why the final image is not merely survival. It is movement upon the heights. Habakkuk is not pictured crawling. He is not spiritually immobilized. He is enabled to walk. The crisis that once left him demanding answers has become the terrain upon which faith learns stability. And this brings us to the final question. What became of Habakkuk's message after the prophet himself disappeared from the biblical narrative? Scripture tells us remarkably little about his later life. It does not provide a detailed account of his death. It does not give us a full biography. It does not describe his family. It does not tell us how long he lived after delivering this prophecy. That silence prevents us from turning legends into history. But Habakkuk's words did not disappear. They survived, and one sentence in particular traveled far beyond the final years of Judah. The righteous shall live by faith. Centuries later, those words would appear in the New Testament. Paul would cite Habakkuk while explaining the righteousness of God and the significance of faith. He would use the prophetic statement in Romans. He would use it again in Galatians. The author of Hebrews would return to Habakkuk when calling believers to endurance. A line spoken in the shadow of Babylon would become part of the language through which the early church understood faith. Yet the New Testament did not erase Habakkuk's original crisis. It built upon it. The man who first heard those words was waiting while an empire rose. He had no visible evidence that the final judgment had arrived. He had to live faithfully before fulfillment. That context gives the later use of Habakkuk extraordinary depth. Faith is not merely agreeing with an idea. It is entrusting life to God before all promises are visible. Habakkuk learned that on the watchtower. He learned it in prayer. He learned it while trembling. And finally, he learned it before an empty field. His book began with a question about divine silence. It ended with worship. His world was still dangerous, but his faith no longer depended upon the world becoming safe first. The final stage of the story is therefore not about another dramatic event in Habakkuk's lifetime. It is about legacy. How did 3 short chapters become one of Scripture's clearest explorations of faith under pressure? Why did the phrase about the righteous living by faith become so important centuries later? What does Habakkuk actually teach about questioning God, and what does he not teach? And how should his final declaration be understood without turning it into a slogan that ignores real suffering? Habakkuk's personal struggle has reached its climax. Now his words are about to travel beyond him. From Judah, beyond Babylon, across centuries, into the writings of the New Testament, and into the lives of generations who would face the same ancient tension in new forms. God is just. The world is broken. The answer is not always immediate. So how shall the righteous live? Habakkuk has given his answer. By faith. Habakkuk's personal struggle has reached its end, but his words have not. The prophet began by asking how long God would allow violence, injustice, and corruption to continue. He then received an answer that frightened him even more than the silence he had feared. Babylon was rising. Judah would face judgment. The instrument of that judgment would itself be violent, arrogant, and destructive. Habakkuk questioned again. He waited. He received a vision. He learned that Babylon's power would not last forever. He heard that the proud would fall. He learned that the righteous must live by faith. He watched through the prophetic vision as the apparent strength of empire was exposed by 5 declarations of woe. Then his argument became prayer. His prayer became remembrance. His remembrance became trust. And finally, before the visible crisis had been resolved, Habakkuk declared that even if the fig tree failed, the vineyard produced nothing, the olive crop disappeared, the fields yielded no food, the flock vanished, and the cattle were gone, he would still rejoice in the Lord. The book ends there. Not with Babylon defeated before Habakkuk's eyes, not with Judah suddenly restored, not with every unanswered question explained. It ends with a man who has learned how to trust God while history is still unfinished. And that may be the most important part of Habakkuk's legacy. The circumstances had not yet changed. Habakkuk had. We should be careful at this point not to add a biography Scripture does not provide. The Bible does not tell us in detail what happened to Habakkuk after the prayer recorded in chapter 3. It does not describe his family. It does not give us a reliable biblical account of his old age. It does not record the circumstances of his death. Later traditions would attempt to fill some of those gaps, as traditions often do around important biblical figures. But those traditions should not be confused with what the canonical text actually says. The biblical Habakkuk remains a remarkably mysterious person. We know the burden he carried. We know the questions he asked. We know the revelation he received. We know the prayer he prayed. And through those 3 chapters, we know something of the transformation that took place inside him. In one sense, that is enough. Because Habakkuk's importance does not depend upon how much biographical information survives. It depends upon the theological problem his book confronts. How can a righteous person live faithfully when the world appears morally disordered? That question did not disappear when Babylon eventually passed from history. Empires changed. The question remained. Habakkuk had lived during a period when international power was shifting dramatically. Assyria's dominance was ending. Babylon was rising. Judah existed beneath the pressure of larger kingdoms. Political leaders could make decisions that altered the lives of thousands of ordinary people. Violence could cross borders quickly. One generation might believe its city was secure, while the next could watch that security disappear. And the prophet's response was not to pretend political events were unimportant. His book is deeply concerned with them. The rise of Babylon matters. Judah's corruption matters. Imperial violence matters. Economic devastation matters. But Habakkuk refuses to allow any of these realities to become ultimate. That distinction explains why his book survived the empire that frightened him. Babylon once appeared larger than Habakkuk. Today, Habakkuk's words are still being read, while Babylon itself belongs to ancient history. That reversal is almost poetic. The empire gathered nations. The prophet had no army. The empire possessed wealth. The prophet possessed questions. The empire raised walls and monuments. The prophet wrote a vision. Yet the military glory of Babylon did exactly what Habakkuk was told it would do. It did not remain forever. The civilization associated with Babylon left enormous historical influence, but the empire that once terrified Judah eventually lost its supremacy. Human power moved again. New rulers appeared. New empires dominated the region. History continued. This is one reason the Book of Habakkuk refuses to equate temporary success with ultimate approval. The most powerful nation of one generation can become the archaeological study of another. The ruler whose decrees once terrified nations can become a name in a chronology. The walls built to make a kingdom appear permanent can become ruins. The proud person sees the present and assumes it will become the future. Faith understands that history belongs to God. That does not mean every historical event should be simplistically identified as direct divine judgment. Habakkuk himself is dealing with a specific prophetic revelation concerning Judah and the Chaldeans. We should not take his book as permission to announce with certainty that every modern war, economic collapse, political defeat, or national disaster has one specific divine meaning known to us. Habakkuk could speak as he did because revelation had been given to him. That is different from speculation. But the theological principle remains powerful. No human power is ultimate. No empire can make itself morally independent from God. Strength does not erase responsibility. Victory does not prove innocence, and delay does not mean justice has ceased to exist. This is the lesson of the 5 woes. The plunderer is accountable for plunder. The one who builds security through unjust gain is not truly secure. The city built by blood carries its own testimony. The one who humiliates others will not remain permanently above shame, and the idol cannot save the person who made it. These warnings are directed in their original context toward the arrogant oppressor, but together they reveal a wider biblical pattern. Pride repeatedly attempts to build permanence out of temporary things. Wealth, military strength, political authority, architecture, technology, territory, reputation. The problem is not that these things possess no value at all. The problem comes when they are asked to carry the weight of ultimate trust. Babylon effectively trusted its net. Habakkuk learned to trust God. That difference defines the book, and nowhere is it expressed more clearly than in Habakkuk 2:4. The proud person is not upright, but the righteous lives by faith, or faithfulness. Within Habakkuk's original setting, this is a call to faithful endurance. The arrogant conqueror lives through self-exaltation. The righteous person must remain faithful to God while waiting for the appointed vision. He may not control history, he may not be able to prevent every disaster, but he can refuse the way of pride. He can remain faithful. Centuries later, this brief statement would become one of Habakkuk's greatest contributions to New Testament theology. The Apostle Paul quotes the principle in his letter to the Romans. There, Paul is explaining the gospel and the righteousness of God. He writes that he is not ashamed of the gospel because it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes. Then, in connection with the revelation of God's righteousness, he invokes the statement, "The righteous shall live by faith." The ancient prophetic sentence enters a new theological argument. Paul is not writing about Babylonian invasion. He is writing about the gospel. Yet the Habakkuk text provides language for the principle that life before God is grounded in faith rather than human self-sufficiency. Paul returns to Habakkuk again in Galatians. There he is arguing that no one is justified before God by the law in the way his opponents imagine. Again he cites, "The righteous shall live by faith." The setting has changed dramatically. Habakkuk had stood in late monarchic Judah. Paul writes to Christian communities in the 1st century Roman world. But the contrast between human self-reliance and faithful dependence upon God continues to speak. This is a good example of how the New Testament can use an Old Testament text while building upon its original meaning. We should not erase Habakkuk's historical context. The verse first belonged to a prophet confronting the rise of Babylon. Its original force involves endurance while waiting for God's appointed justice. But the principle proved capable of speaking into a much larger biblical theology of faith. Then Hebrews uses Habakkuk in another context. The audience is being called to endurance. They are warned not to throw away their confidence. They need perseverance, and once again the language of Habakkuk appears. The coming one will come and will not delay. The righteous one will live by faith. The theme of waiting becomes especially important here. Habakkuk had waited on the watchtower. He had been told that the vision had an appointed time. He had learned not to confuse apparent delay with failure. Hebrews uses that language to strengthen believers who themselves must endure. This helps us see why Habakkuk's message traveled so far beyond its original political crisis. At its core, the book asks how faithful people live in the interval between promise and fulfillment, between prayer and answer, between judgment announced and judgment seen, between danger recognized and deliverance completed, between what God has revealed and what the believer has not yet witnessed. Human beings spend much of life in intervals like these. We rarely possess the complete outcome of the story we are currently living. Habakkuk did not. That is why his watchtower remains such a powerful image. He stands between the question and the fulfillment. He watches, he listens, he waits. And the final lesson is not merely that the waiting eventually ends. The lesson is that the righteous must learn how to live while waiting. That is where faith exists. Habakkuk's story also helps correct a common misunderstanding about questioning God. His book does not teach that genuine faith never asks difficult questions. Habakkuk asks extraordinarily difficult questions. He asks why God tolerates violence. He asks why justice is distorted. He asks how a holy God can use Babylon. He asks whether the conqueror will continue destroying nations without mercy. These questions are not removed from Scripture. They are preserved in Scripture. That fact matters. The Bible does not present mature faith as the absence of emotional or intellectual struggle, but neither does Habakkuk present questioning as an end in itself. The prophet does not build an identity around permanent outrage. He does not ask questions only to hear the sound of his own protest. He expects God to answer. He remains willing to be corrected. He waits. He listens. The direction of his questioning matters. His questions move toward God rather than away from God. And as the conversation continues, Habakkuk changes. This is why the phrase questioning God needs careful definition. There is a difference between bringing a question to God and placing oneself above God as his judge. Habakkuk does the first. He speaks boldly, but he also stands on the watchtower, prepared to hear what God will say to him. That posture combines honesty with humility. Faith can contain both. Another misunderstanding should also be avoided. Habakkuk's final declaration is sometimes treated as though faith requires emotional indifference to suffering. But Habakkuk clearly experiences fear. He says he trembles. His lips quiver. Weakness enters his bones. He is not emotionally detached. Therefore, the lesson of Habakkuk 3 is not, a person of faith should never feel afraid. The lesson is closer to this. Fear does not have to become the final authority over faith. Habakkuk trembles and trusts. Those two experiences exist in the same person. He is afraid of what may happen. He still rejoices in God. That is far more realistic than pretending faithful people never experience anxiety, grief, or uncertainty. The book also teaches us not to confuse faith with optimism. Optimism usually expects events to become favorable. Habakkuk imagines events becoming devastating. The fig tree may not bloom. The vines may produce nothing. The olives may fail. The fields may produce no food. The livestock may disappear. He does not build his final confession on the expectation that these things will immediately reverse. Instead, he says, "Yet." That is faith. It does not require the prediction that tomorrow will be easier. It requires confidence that God remains God, even if tomorrow is difficult. This is one of the most demanding forms of trust anywhere in Scripture, and it is important to understand why the agricultural imagery is so powerful. Modern readers can easily turn the passage into a metaphor too quickly, but Habakkuk's images represent real economic life. The absence of fruit and livestock could mean poverty, food insecurity, loss of livelihood, the collapse of household stability. Habakkuk is not describing a minor inconvenience. He is imagining the failure of the systems upon which people depend. Therefore, his declaration should never be used to dismiss the suffering of people facing material hardship. The point is not that hunger does not matter. The point is that even hunger cannot transform God into someone unfaithful. There is an enormous difference. Faith does not minimize suffering. It refuses to absolutize suffering. Habakkuk also helps us understand the relationship between justice and patience. At the beginning, he finds waiting nearly impossible. How long? That question is understandable. When injustice continues, delay itself can feel immoral. The victim wants judgment now. The observer wants intervention now. The prophet wants action now. God does announce action, but then Habakkuk learns that even divine judgment unfolds according to an appointed time. He must wait. This does not mean justice is unimportant. It means Habakkuk is not the one who controls its timetable. That lesson requires humility. Human beings naturally want immediate moral symmetry. The righteous should prosper now. The wicked should fall now. The faithful should be protected now. The oppressor should be stopped now. Sometimes Scripture records moments in which judgment does arrive quickly. But Habakkuk lives through a different kind of story. Judgment comes through a complicated historical process. Judah itself is guilty. Babylon becomes an instrument. Babylon itself is guilty. Babylon will also be judged. History is morally serious without being morally simple. That complexity is one reason Habakkuk remains valuable. He refuses simplistic categories. Judah is the covenant nation, but that does not make Judah immune from judgment. Babylon is used within divine judgment, but that does not make Babylon righteous. The prophet is faithful, but that does not mean he understands everything immediately. God may appear silent, but that does not mean he is inactive. Babylon may appear victorious, but that does not mean it has won the final verdict. The harvest may fail, but that does not mean God has ceased to be the God of salvation. Again and again, appearance is not the whole reality. This is where the message of Habakkuk becomes deeply connected to the entire biblical story. The Bible repeatedly warns against judging ultimate reality by the present moment alone. Abraham receives a promise long before its fullness is visible. Joseph is sold before he is elevated. Israel enters slavery before the Exodus. David is anointed before he becomes king. The people experience exile before restoration. The disciples witness crucifixion before resurrection. The early church suffers while proclaiming a kingdom whose fullness remains future. Habakkuk belongs within that same pattern of promise, waiting, crisis, and faith. Yet we should not force every detail of his book into a direct prophecy about Jesus. Habakkuk speaks first into his own historical setting. The Babylonian crisis is real. Judah's corruption is real. The 5 woes concern real arrogance and oppression. The agricultural imagery belongs to the world Habakkuk knows. The book gains theological depth when its original meaning is respected, not when that meaning is erased. At the same time, the New Testament itself demonstrates that Habakkuk's declaration about faith has continuing significance. The connection is therefore not invented. It is scripturally established. And this is how Habakkuk can be located within the larger movement of the Bible. He stands near the end of Judah's independent life as a kingdom. The nation carries the Davidic heritage. Jerusalem still stands. The temple still stands. But the political future is darkening. The sins warned about by earlier prophets are producing consequences. Babylon is approaching. The exile will become one of the defining crises of Old Testament history. Habakkuk's book teaches the faithful how to stand at the edge of that crisis. It does not tell them that covenant identity removes all consequences. It tells them to trust God even through judgment. That matters because the exile could have appeared to destroy everything. The land, the monarchy, Jerusalem, the temple, national independence. If those visible institutions disappeared, had God's promises disappeared with them? The larger biblical story answers no. The exile would not become the end. There would be return. There would be restoration. The prophetic hope would continue. And eventually the biblical story would move toward the coming of Jesus and the announcement of the kingdom of God. Habakkuk does not see all of that in detail. We should not pretend he does. but he learns the posture required to live when the next chapter remains invisible. Faith. That is his gift to the generations after him. Habakkuk also leaves us with an important warning about the temptation to worship power. The image of Babylon sacrificing to its net may be one of the most memorable critiques of human arrogance in Scripture. The conqueror succeeds through his instrument. Then he begins treating the instrument as the reason for his success. The tool becomes an idol. This pattern can occur far beyond literal military conquest. Human beings can begin trusting wealth because wealth has solved problems before. They can trust political influence because influence once produced results. They can trust intelligence because intelligence has brought success. They can trust technology because technology extends human capacity. They can trust institutions because institutions once provided stability. None of these things must automatically be rejected as evil. The danger appears when the net receives the worship that belongs to God. Habakkuk exposes that temptation. A tool can be useful. It cannot become ultimate. Babylon does not recognize the difference. The empire worships its own strength, and the empire eventually falls. Habakkuk, by contrast, ends with almost nothing visible. No fruitful vineyard, no productive field, no crowded stalls. Yet spiritually, he is stronger than Babylon. Why? Because the empire's strength depends upon possessing more. Habakkuk's strength depends upon God. The empire becomes weaker when its resources are removed. Habakkuk discovers a source of strength that loss cannot confiscate. This is perhaps the most dramatic reversal in the entire book. Babylon appears powerful because it has everything. Habakkuk appears vulnerable because he may lose everything. Yet Babylon is the unstable one. Habakkuk has found the foundation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. That line brings us back to the title of his story, From Questioning God to Unshakable Faith. But unshakable does not mean emotionally unmoved. Habakkuk shakes, his body trembles. What becomes unshakable is the foundation beneath him. That distinction is crucial. A person can tremble while standing on something solid. A person can feel fear while refusing to surrender trust. A person can grieve and still believe. A person can ask why and still worship. Habakkuk's story makes room for all of those realities. That is why his faith is compelling. It is not plastic. It has scars from the questions it has passed through. The final Habakkuk is not the man from chapter 1 with his emotions erased. He is the same man with a larger vision of God. And perhaps that is the simplest way to understand his transformation. At first, his crisis filled his entire field of vision. By the end, God filled more of it. The injustice did not become smaller because injustice stopped mattering. Babylon did not become less dangerous because military power was imaginary. The harvest did not become unimportant because spirituality replaced food. God simply became the largest reality in Habakkuk's understanding. Once that happened, everything else changed position. Babylon became temporary. Waiting became possible. Fear became survivable. Loss became painful but not ultimate. And faith became possible before the outcome was visible. That is the legacy of Habakkuk. Not an explanation for every form of suffering, not permission to declare every disaster a direct act of divine judgment, not a promise that faithful people will always be materially protected, not a command to suppress questions, not a celebration of pain. His legacy is the discovery that faith can survive unresolved circumstances because its foundation is not the circumstances. The book begins with a prophet who cannot understand why God seems silent. It ends with a prophet capable of worship in an empty field. Between those two moments stands an entire theology of waiting. God hears. God acts. Human beings may not understand his action immediately. Pride does not last forever. Violence is accountable. Justice has an appointed time. The righteous must live faithfully. And remember, in what God has done becomes strength for facing what has not yet been resolved. If Habakkuk were only remembered for one verse, "The righteous shall live by faith," would be enough to make his book significant. But the power of that verse becomes even greater when we see the journey around it. Those words were not spoken in comfort. They were spoken beneath the shadow of empire. They were not spoken because every promise had already been visibly fulfilled. They were spoken because fulfillment had not yet arrived. They were not theoretical. Habakkuk eventually had to embody them. He did. That is why the final chapter matters so much. The righteous live by faith, and then Habakkuk shows us what that can look like. The field is empty, yet. The vine is barren, yet. The olive fails, yet. The flock is gone, yet. The future is frightening, yet. The prophet trembles, yet. I will rejoice in the Lord. That yet may be Habakkuk's greatest testimony. It stands between circumstance and faith. It refuses to deny either one. It looks directly at loss and still looks beyond loss. It acknowledges what has been taken while remembering what cannot be taken. That does not make Habakkuk less human. It reveals what his faith has become. And this is where his story still speaks to anyone who has ever prayed and waited. Anyone who has looked at injustice and wondered why it continued. Anyone who has received an answer different from the one they wanted. Anyone who has watched circumstances deteriorate despite faithful prayer. Anyone who has had to choose between trusting only what could be seen and trusting the character of God. Habakkuk does not give such people an easy formula. He gives them a journey. Ask honestly. Listen humbly. Wait faithfully. Remember what God has done. Refuse the arrogance that turns human strength into an idol. Do not mistake delay for divine absence. Do not mistake temporary power for permanent victory. And when visible supports begin to disappear, return again to the foundation beneath them all. The Lord is still God. Habakkuk's world changed around him. Empires rose, judgment approached. The future of Judah darkened. But somewhere inside that storm, the prophet reached a place no Babylonian army could conquer. Trust. And because of that, the final image of Habakkuk is not of a man crushed beneath history. It is of a man standing on the heights. Not because the mountain became easy, because God became his strength. The prophet began by demanding to know when God would change the world around him. He ended by discovering what God had changed within him. The questions had not been wasted. The waiting had not been empty. The fear had not defeated him. And the silence he once feared had become the place where he learned to listen. So the story of Habakkuk closes with one of the clearest paradoxes in Scripture. The world can shake without shaking the one who holds it. The harvest can fail without making God unfaithful. An empire can rise without becoming eternal. And a believer can tremble without losing faith. Habakkuk questioned. Habakkuk waited. Habakkuk trembled. And Habakkuk trusted. His circumstances had not yet changed, but his vision of God had. And from that moment forward, he no longer needed a full field in order to worship. The empire would pass. The questions would remain meaningful, but faith had found its foundation. If you followed Habakkuk's journey to the end, tell us which prophet or biblical book you would like to see explored next in this Complete Bible Stories series. Subscribe if you want to continue seeing Scripture as one connected story where the questions, crises, promises, and people of each book lead into something larger. And if you want to continue naturally from Habakkuk's world, the story of Jeremiah and the fall of Jerusalem is one of the most powerful places to go next. Because Habakkuk learned to trust while Babylon was approaching. Jeremiah would live through what happened when Babylon finally arrived. Habakkuk's questions ended in faith, but Judah's darkest chapter was still ahead.